Is Christianity dying in the West? Well, let's talk about on this episode of Journey at Home. It is great to have you with us. We are creating content that makes it simple for you to follow Jesus. So do me a favor, subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's going to help a lot more people see this content, and you won't miss what we're creating for you over the next few weeks. Now, let's jump into today's conversation. Back in 2019, Tom Holland, the historian, released a book called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, where he unpacks how Jesus and his teachings have influenced the way the Western world thinks. Now, if you've never heard of Tom, he is considered to be one of the preeminent historians of our day, who's written extensively about both Roman and Persian history. But in this book, he turns his attention to Christianity. And I want to share with you a bit of his conclusion from the book. He says, and I quote, "People in the West, even those who may imagine that they have emancipated themselves from Christian belief, in fact, are shot through with Christian assumptions about almost everything. All of us in the West," he writes, "are goldfish, and the water that we swim in is Christianity," end quote. In other words, Tom says most everything we value, the rights we hold so dear as Americans, they can all be traced back to the teachings of Jesus. Pre-Jesus, these values, concepts, and beliefs that appear self-evident to us, well, they either didn't exist or they weren't accepted. And the irony, according to Tom, who isn't a Jesus follower, by the way, is that even people who reject Jesus, well, they have their values anchored in Jesus. They just don't know it. Because, to use his phrase, we swim in Christian waters. Let me give you one example. Jesus taught, and as his followers, we believe all humans are created with equal dignity, value, and worth. But you have to understand, that is a relatively new point of view in human history. It comes straight from Jesus and his teachings that we were created in the image of God, and therefore, everyone matters to God. So you remove that central idea, and there is no foundation that allows you to suggest everyone is equally valuable. But while we all swim in the wake of Jesus' teaching, those of us who follow Jesus, well, we're called to live in those teachings too. And that is an entirely different level of accountability that we might prefer not to have. This is episode 2 of our series, Be Known for Something Good, where we're exploring what it means to be for as a church, but also what for requires of those of us who are Jesus followers. Because for, it's a really powerful word. It's an inclusive word. It's a word that draws people in. And we believe for is what our church should be known for, because it's what Jesus was known for. But while being for others sounds great in concept, it's very difficult in application. I'll give you an example. While it is true that Jesus introduced to the world this idea that everyone matters to God, that is not all there is to that thought. Jesus also taught that everyone matters to God, whether God matters to them or not. In other words, God's love for a person isn't impacted, influenced, or dictated by their love for him. After all, as the Apostle Paul wrote, while we were still sinners, in other words, while we were still rejecting God, Christ died for us. He does not love us because we deserve it. He loves us even though we don't. Jesus went so far as to teach this was central to what it means to follow him. So one day, a Jewish religious teacher, he asked Jesus to simplify what matters most to God. And here was Jesus' famous reply in Matthew 22. He said, "Teacher, what's the greatest commandment in the law?" This was a question this guy wanted to know. Now, there were 613 different laws, but Jesus summarizes them all into 2, which he then says are really just one and the same. Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment." In other words, you should love God with your whole being. You want me to sum it up? Here it is. It's the most important thing you can do. Now, this sounds like a great answer, but Jesus knew there is a problem with it. It's vague. It's immeasurable. Nobody knows if you're actually loving God with all your heart or not because it's intangible and invisible. Think about it. I can't see your heart. You can't see my heart. So it's really easy for us to claim, I love God. But that feels like an invisible thing between you and God. Something this important can't be that vague. But that's how people had viewed it for centuries. So Jesus does something extraordinary here. He redefines loving God in a way that they didn't see coming. He defines loving God in a way that is both tangible and measurable. And quite honestly, this is a part none of us really like, because he defines it in a way that holds us accountable. Jesus went on to add, and the second command is like it. In other words, I'm going to give you a second command, but it's actually the first command just said in a different way. And here it was. Love your neighbor as yourself. Which I go, well, wait a minute. You're telling me I'm supposed to love my neighbor as much as I love myself? Who does that? That doesn't really make any sense, does it? Everybody knows you got to take care of yourself first. If I love my neighbor as much as I love myself, it may not be good for myself. There's going to be some internal conflicts between what's best for myself and what's best for my neighbor. And if I'm loving them as much as me, I'd have to put them before me. And who would do that? And Jesus goes, well, that's the point. People who love God do that. Because your love for God is measured by your love for others. In other words, you only love God to the extent that you love your neighbor like you love yourself. Now, if this doesn't seem right to you, here's the easiest way to wrap your head around it. And I've mentioned this before. If you do something to intentionally hurt one of my kids, let's say you say something unkind to them, or you lose your temper on them, or you take an opportunity away from them, you treat them unfairly, and then you grab lunch with me the very next day and act like nothing's wrong, well, we have a problem. How do you think lunch is going to go? It will not be relaxing, I can promise you. We're going to have a very direct conversation because until you make things right with my kids, things are not right between you and me. And if you were to say to me, but Matt, that's not fair. I didn't do anything to you. I'd go, oh, you bet you did. You did something to me because you hurt someone who matters to me. It is ridiculous to think you can hurt my kids and be good with me. On the other hand, if you are loving and kind to my kids, if you encourage and help my kids, oh my gosh, we're great. I wouldn't even need to know you to like you, because when you love one of my kids, you're loving me. Now, if I feel that way, and I'm not a perfect father, how do you think your perfect heavenly Father feels when you interact with one of his kids? This is why Jesus said these two commands are two ways of saying the same thing. When you love others, you love God. When you don't love others, you don't love God. Your love for God is measured by your love for others. Now, one of the things true for all of us is whenever we're challenged in a way we don't like, we want to find a loophole. So when Jesus was explaining this on another occasion, somebody in the crowd actually raised their hand and said, well, wait a minute, Jesus, who is my neighbor? In other words, let's be clear on who I should love, because this is what drove the question. Jewish people believed their only neighbors were fellow Jews. So they were expecting Jesus to define neighbor in very narrow terms. But to their complete shock, Jesus defined neighbor as everyone in every nation and every generation. In other words, Jesus took away our ability to justify only loving certain people like we love ourselves. Neighbor cannot just be the people like me. My neighbor is the person also who doesn't believe like me, behave like me, look like me. So until I'm loving people who are nothing like me, who are different than me, who annoy me, frustrate me, hurt me, until I love them like I love myself, I've got some room to grow in loving God. Because again, your love for God is measured by your love for everyone in every nation and every generation. And if you find yourself going, well, that's impossible. Who could do that? Well, you've just discovered the high bar that Jesus set for us. You've just realized it is impossible to love this way without God's help. You can't do it on your own. This is not easy or natural. So every single year, we focus for a few weeks on practicing loving like this together as we do our annual 4 offering. And we kicked this off last episode, but if you're new, here's how it works. We have a team of volunteers who talk to nonprofits throughout our communities, and they ask them, well, what would make a big difference for you? What would help you make a big difference? And these nonprofits, they do not have to be explicitly Christian nonprofits. Most of them aren't, as a matter of fact. They don't have to serve people whose beliefs and behaviors are like ours. It doesn't matter if they don't. It doesn't even matter if these people like us or not. We're just going to show up and love them like we love ourselves, because that's what it means to love God. So I invited you last episode to give to this to help fund these projects that these nonprofits have. If you haven't given yet, I'm going to ask you now to give as big as you can possibly give, because we give every single penny away to fund these projects to make a big difference for these nonprofits. So you make your gift to the 4 Fund. You can go to our app, or you can go to givejourney.com right now. Just click on the 4 Fund, make a gift. And our only goal is 100% participation, because all of us who call Journey home, come on, we should practice loving people who are different than us, people who can't give back to us. Now, last episode, I told you about some of the local projects that we're going to fund. In this episode, I want to highlight how we're also going to love our neighbors that we haven't met in different nations. See, a part of what you give will help fund new churches, just like ours, that are being started in communities where there are no churches like this. One of the churches you helped fund just held their first services last month. Another one launched several months earlier. They're already running about 150 people. Another one starting in January up in Alberta, Canada. And the one in North Carolina, we got two actually in North Carolina. They're both going strong now. So we're going to invest again in our partnership with them, but we're also going to invest in a partnership we're in with Andover Church and the Further Faster Network in the UK. Now, some of you may remember, we started this partnership last year because only 6% of people in the UK attend church. But Andover is trying to change that in their community. So for the last year, our staff has been doing regular Zoom calls with the team there at Andover. We've been sharing ideas back and forth, helping one another. And Andover not only is impacting their community, but they have helped start a larger network of churches throughout the UK that are all trying to make it simple for people to follow Jesus. And so part of your financial investment not only helps Andover, it helps this network train more churches to reach their communities. And this network is growing fast across the UK and Ireland. Now, why would we do this? Well, because this is what it looks like to love God. You love your neighbor from every nation and from every generation, just like you love yourself. So I want to ask you again, will you give and will you give big? And let's learn to love like Jesus loves us, because that's what it means to be for everyone.